Hello everyone, welcome to lecture 60 of week 12. So, today we are going to sum up whatever we have learned in this course from my part. So, if you remember the initial part of the course, we started talking about the definition of language and what this course is about, etc. So, we will talk about them, go back to the certain notions which we have learnt initially, specifically the knowledge of language and related questions. We will be talking about the different areas that we discussed in detail: morphology, syntax, semantics and pragmatics. We will be basically talking about some key notions from these areas, and then we will talk about sociolinguistics, the central ideas of sociolinguistics that we have already learnt, and language teaching, certain concepts that we have already discussed. So, if you ask yourself at this point that what exactly did you learn from this course, maybe it will be a good idea to revise the topics that we have covered. So, we started the course from definition of language. Please note that I am not saying a language, but language. So, we learnt about a very new definition by Chomsky. We discussed a few common and popular notions and definitions of language initially, and then talked about the new definition of Chomsky, which is basically a paradigm shift in the domain of linguistics. Then we talked about a few knowledge of language questions. If you remember the point that I have mentioned on the slide, how do we learn so much from so little? So, here if you remember, we are talking about the input. The input is little, but we actually say a lot of things and also understand a lot of things because of the rules. The next bullet point talks about the fact that rules play a major role, and also to remind you the notions of competence and performance, which are basically about the knowledge of language. So, if you remember, competence is about knowledge of language and performance is about the usage. We also said that the ideas of competence and performance differs from the ideas of Lang and Parole, which is by Saussure. We talked about universal grammar and the faculty of language questions, if you remember, and then we said that there are different levels of linguistic analysis. It includes phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics and pragmatics. We learnt about different units for all these levels, and as we have seen, rule is the primary emphasis for us. So, we did talk about rules concerning all these domains. So, you learnt about phonetics and phonology, and then we started talking about morphology, and basically our knowledge of phonetics and phonology were also useful for us. In morphology, if you remember, we talked about certain new units like morpheme. You have learned that this is an abstract unit. Morpheme is not the word, and we should not say that word is the unit for the study of word structure, but it is something else. Morpheme, which is abstract, which is a very small unit which is associated with some kind of meaning. And we talked about morph and allomorph, which exist in complementary distribution. We have also discussed the examples, if you remember. We did talk about different types of morphemes. To remind you, we talked about the differences between free and bound morph and lexical and functional morph, which will be useful for analysis even in syntax, that we have seen later, right. We talked about certain morphological processes. To remind you a few of them: compounding, and we have seen that inflection and derivation play a major role in morphological analysis and process, because inflectional morphemes, if you add them, they do not change the grammatical category, but if you add derivational morphemes, the grammatical category of the word will be changed. And I hope you remembered that even for syntax we have seen that these differences and these ideas will be super useful. We also talked about morphological typology, keeping in mind the word and morpheme ratio, and we discussed that different languages of the world can be classified according to the word morpheme ratio. So, we have spent a couple of classes discussing something called syntax, and by now you know that initially we talked about something like a black box which is there, and we are just trying to understand what is happening in the black box inside our head if we consider language. So, we have seen that the ideas of native speaker and grammatical judgment is very important for us in syntax. So, we said that some inputs are going through the black box and we can get some output. So, by analyzing the input and output we can comment on the nature of rules, we can comment on the processes that are taking place inside the black box. And we also talked about different types of adequacies, if you remember. So, these are observational adequacies and explanatory adequacies, for example, if you remember. So, we talked about all these things, and descriptive adequacy as well. We did talk about syntactic categories. So, for example, if you say lexical categories like noun, verb, preposition, etc., and there are certain functional categories like I and D. So, we have talked about them, and T of course, and we said that these categories are related to the function of words in a sentence. If you remember, along with the category we talked about some subcategories too. For example, plurality as a subcategory of nouns. We did learn about something called predicate. This is very different from our knowledge of predicate in school grammar. So, in when we talked about predicate, we said that it is basically indicating some kind of relation in a sentence, and along with predicate we talked about the argument structure which is related to the idea of predicate. We found that the argument structures differ according to transitivity. So, if you remember the number of arguments which change according to the kind of transitivity. So, there are intransitives, transitives, ditransitives, etc., if you consider the verbs. We discussed about the idea of constituents and also defined constituents and discussed certain tests for constituency, if you remember. We said that certain words which are grouped together and also function together are the constituents. If you remember, we talked about tests like substitution and movement which can figure out the constituents of sentences. And we said that constituents are embedded one inside another to create larger constituents. So, this is also related to the hierarchy of the sentence, if you remember the hierarchy part. So, we are saying that these are the constituents are embedded one inside another, which is an important notion in syntax. Along with the constituents, we talked about phrase structure rules or PSRs, and we said that phrase structure rules generate phrase structure trees of a sentence. I hope you remember how to draw trees. We have actually tried to draw some very simple trees, and I asked you to draw some trees of the sentences that I had given to you. I hope you have done the exercises and now you are pretty okay with you understood the structure of the trees. We discussed the ideas of deep structure and surface structure, which are basically two layers of sentences, and as we talked about certain ambiguity puzzles which are not lexical ambiguity, but structural ambiguity. So, we have seen that the idea of dip structure and surface structure can actually help us to solve certain ambiguity puzzles. We talked about X bar theory, which is basically a component of the government and binding theory that you have learnt. So, we said that X bar theory follows a schema. So, whenever you are using X bar theory to analyze a sentence or to draw a tree of a sentence, you will always see that it is following a particular schema. And as a part of X bar theory, we learnt about head, complement, specifier and adjuncts. We have seen that certain functional categories have importance in syntax, and for example, if you consider maximal projections or XPs, we have found there are certain maximal projections like IP, DP and TP, where the functional category is basically the head of the maximal projections and which play a major role in the structure rather analyzing the structure. We said that syntactic trees can be interpreted with some relations. You remember those diagrams that we discussed in classes. So, we talked about different parts of a tree. In fact, that was the name of a lecture. So, when we talked about different parts of tree, we talked about node, branch, etc. We learnt about different labels along with the ideas of dominance and precedence. So, for example, if you remembered the idea of C command, we did talk about some kind of dominance, and precedence we have found is important when we consider linear structure instead of hierarchical structures. We talked about C selection and S selection, category selection and semantic selection as a part of syntax, and when we already learnt about the argument structure. So, we said that arguments have different semantic relations with verbs, which we can explain with the help of theta theory. We said that lexical information is syntactically represented, and also all sentences must have subjects, if you remember EPP, the extended projection principle. We talked briefly about the government and binding theory and talked about the model of, or rather the approach of the minimalist program briefly. We said that language is basically a computational system which is a perfect solution for relating sound and meaning. So, sound meaning pairs are always important, and we are considering the computational system where the sound meaning pair is there. We said that derivations will always follow an economic criteria, and we have also seen that features are the syntactic formatives in the minimalist program. So, features are basically different kinds of features. If you remember the interpretable and uninterpretable features that we have discussed briefly, these will be helpful for us to discuss syntax for this model. After doing syntax, we move to semantics, and we said that meaning is the major part of semantics. So, we talked about compositionality in the very beginning, and we said that meaning of the component parts are important for the meaning of a structure. So, the components can have different meanings, and the structure which is created with the help of those components can have a different meaning. So, we started semantics from this point actually, if you remember. We learnt about certain notions in semantics like presupposition, which is related to certain assumptions or beliefs, and entailment, which reflects our lexical knowledge. As a part of semantics, we also discussed the ideas of reference and sense, which are related concepts. We discussed some examples as well. Remember the example of the morning star and the evening star? I hope this example will actually help you act as a clue to remember the difference between sense and reference. We devoted one entire class for discussing lexical semantics, and we have seen that there are different kinds of lexical relations. For example, homonymy, polysemy, synonymy, antonymy, hyponymy and meronymy. So, all these relations were discussed in terms of some examples. If you are not remembering the examples right now, you can always go back to the previous lectures and look at the examples. So, pragmatics is something where we started talking about invisible meanings. So, we said that pragmatics deals with invisible meanings and it deals with the meaning which is not a part of semantic system. So, it is related to meaning, but the meaning is not coming from the semantic system, rather it is coming from the context. So, we talked about ideas of deixis, reference, inference, entailment, etc. And if you remember, we also talked about the Gricean maxims while talking about different types of speech acts as well. In one class we talked about scripts. We said that language and script has certain relationships and we talked about development of scripts from a historical perspective and different types of scripts that we can get in different time and different geographical areas. We said that different types of scripts in ancient and contemporary world can be classified in certain ways. As this part of the discussion on language and scripts, we also said that script is used as a tool of identity politics. After that, we came to sociolinguistics, where we also spent a couple of classes in discussing the notions of sociolinguistics. We initially we said that we always make choices when we speak. We talked about notions like language maintenance and language shift, and we also talked about certain relation with migration. So, if you remember, we said that in case of migration, a community may decide to shift their language, a community may also decide to maintain their language. So, we discussed the idea of shift and maintenance in terms of migration as well, and we discussed some examples in Indian context, if you remember. After that, we talked about the differences between vernaculars and standard languages. We have seen that if we want to define the vernaculars, we say that these are basically the colloquial languages which is not written, but spoken for the purpose of communication by communities. And we have seen that there are differences with standard languages, as there are certain processes in the when we talk about standardization. So, standardization has several stages and we talked about it in detail, while we also discussed some case studies in a discussion. So, we talked about stages like selection, codification, elaboration of function and acceptance, which are the processes of standardization. And along with standard languages, we discussed standard language ideology, which is an emerging field in sociolinguistics in recent days. We discussed the idea of lingua franca or link language, which is basically means of communication for different communities. So, when different communities stay together, they can develop some link language and these can be different. So, we talked about something called pidgin, which is a trade language where different communities need to talk to each other for trading purpose, found mostly in the coast areas. So, one community is coming to the coast for trading, and the people of the coast will not understand the other group. They will develop a kind of language which is known as pidgin, and when pidgin is acquired by people as mother tongue, it was considered as a Creole, but now we also discussed about the recent developments in Creole studies, where people are claiming that it is not the case. Creoles can develop before pidgins. So, in sociolinguistics, we also talked about the differences between dialect and standard language. So, these two bullet points are very important for us that we have discussed in classes. we said that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, if you remember. So, this is basically to highlight the power relationship. We said that earlier dialects were defined on the basis of size of the community, the speech community, and also mutual intelligibility, but rather than these two factors, we consider power as the more important factor for deciding a standard language and differentiating with a dialect. Along with that, we have also said that a language is a dialect with written norms. As we have learned from standardization process, language will always have some codified texts. What do we mean by codified texts? If you remember, we talked about dictionaries, grammars, etc., which are written as a part of the standardization drive, and that is why we say that a language is a dialect with written norms. And it is also associated with a popular belief that a dialect will never have written forms. We talked about the idea of accommodation, if you remember, and we said that accommodation can be either upward or downward. So, when we are saying upward and downward, we are of course talking about some kind of hierarchy which is present, and along with the accommodation, we discussed about variations in terms of language varieties. We said that there are regional variations and social variations when we talk about dialect. And also to remind you, we talked about a dialect chain or continuum, which is also important along with identifying the regional and social variation. We talked about the idea of social stratification, which plays a major role in deciding the nature of dialects. So, we borrow certain ideas from social sciences, the domains of social sciences, and say that social stratification will also have an effect in the nature of dialects. We discussed different models of language variation, if you remember, and we talked about variations as discussed by William Lebov, who is also considered as the father of sociolinguistics. So, we did talk about Lebovian variation, where variation is basically related to some structural aspects, if you remember, and we said that the patterns of variation are studied along with some social factors. So, we do talk about the patterns of variations in terms of its structure, but social factors are also taken into account. We spent one entire class discussing about language change from socio-historical perspective and found that language basically changes across space and social group. So, we can talk about language change from different perspectives, and we can say that we can talk about language change which is occurring from above and change which is occurring from below. So, we talked about, for if you remember, the case of Martha's Vineyard by Lebov, and we discussed this idea of change from above and below, just to remind you. So, we talked about different models which are used in sociolinguistics as well as historical linguistics. For example, the tree model, so family tree kind of a model where we talk about the relatedness among languages from a historical perspective, and also the reconstruction of the protoforms, if you remember. We said that wave model is basically a model which criticized the tree model and said that no, it is not like a tree, a hierarchy, rather it is just like waves which are created after throwing a pebble in a pond. So, there will be some kind of diffusion which will rather talk about the changes and classification of languages. And along with that, we discussed the idea of lexical diffusion, if you remember. So, how it diffuses in an area, how language change can be described in terms of the diffusion. In sociolinguistics, we also talked about the speaker's identity, and we said that language reveals the speaker's identity, which is a social construct. It is not given to someone, identity is constructed in the society and it is multi-layered. So, it will one person can have multiple identities, which can be expressed in terms of the language use. We talked about language teaching as well. We said that there are changes in language teaching methods in different points of history. If you remember the grammar translation method, which were used for learning classical languages, and we are talking about learning here in a formal environment, not acquisition. I hope you all already understand the differences. So, we said that grammar translation methods and methods which have been used earlier are now replaced with newer methods like community language teaching or TPR, and we found that behavioristic theory influenced certain methods like audiolingual method, and generative theory also influenced certain newer methods. We found that sacred languages like Latin or Sanskrit were basically considered for the language of literacy, but it was replaced by modern languages when there was a rise of nationalist movement in different corners of the world, and birth of modern languages came with the new language teaching method, replacement of old methods, and also teaching of different languages. We talked about language teaching methods related to various approaches. If you remember, we talked about structural approach, functional approach, and interactional approach, which are useful for us to know if we are discussing about language teaching. As a part of language teaching, we also discussed a child's talk and teacher's talk in a classroom from an applied linguistic perspective, and we said that these have different dimensions. We can talk about child's talk and teacher's talk in different ways. Child's talk from a language acquisition perspective, for example, and teacher's talk from a skill based perspective. So, we found that there are 4 basic linguistic skills: listening, speaking, reading and writing, which are used in classroom, and keeping in mind the developmental, sociolinguistic and structural perspective, we can design different tasks in language classrooms. We said that sociolinguistic variation can be used as a tool for language teaching, and we also talked about certain case studies where variation is actually being utilized for classroom. And as a part of language teaching, we learnt about the deficit hypothesis discussed by Bernstein, and where the ideas of elaborated code and restricted code were introduced to you. And we said that hybrid languages can be used for classroom use in order to keep in mind the children's familiarity issues as well as the social justice issues. We also spent one class talking about language policy, and we said that language policy is a newer term for language planning. So, we found that people basically engineered the choice of language in different times. I hope now you understand why I am using the term engineering, because it is a kind of force which is coming from outside. And we talked about different types of planning like status planning, status of a language, corpus planning, modification in the status planning component, acquisition planning, where a person is supposed to learn a language for language planning initiatives, and diffusion planning, where certain external or internal initiatives like missionary activities were basically the factors for language learning. We discussed the case of India, where colonialism shaped the language policies. Specifically, we talked about the language policies for English as well as vernacular languages. So, these are the topics that we have discussed in the course, and it will be a good idea to have a sum up class, so that you can figure out whatever you have learnt and also brush up certain areas where you need more focus. I hope you enjoyed learning with us. So, thank you.